controversial subjects with the facts can be tense, but we are A$AP Science here to make things make sense.
Whenever you do Google incest, so much stuff comes up about Game of Thrones.
Yeah, well, it's actually, and maybe it's like historically accurate, even though we're like in a mythological show. It is wild.
I hate that about Game of Thrones. I'm not a Game of Thrones head. Mitch is. They're always like whenever I'm sort of like, well, in the first seasons, I'm like, there's no black people. You're like, well, it's based on.
I'm not saying this.
No, I know, but I'm like, no, it's not. There's dragons. This is like some made up shit. Like, I love how people like resort to being like, oh, it's actually medieval.
It's like medieval Europe.
It's not. It's like there's like a frozen world with like wolves and with blue eyes or whatever that like kill. I actually don't really know what Game of Thrones is about, but so like the Game of
people
Thrones.
say that as well when it comes to like incest and stuff, because it's like, oh, like ancient royals would have been marrying their cousins, and
it's like there's dragons here, my friends. But okay, the interesting sort of, if you do start to learn about inbreeding in humans, they do talk about the royals.
Yeah, because it is, I think, a common practice, through history, to keep families like quote unquote pure and wanting like bloodlines to always have. So like to marry off cousins or those kinds of things or like create alliances between families, I think was like kind of a more common practice than it would be today, obviously.
So they said that so one issue with incest in humans is if there's like a recessive disease, it's more likely that it will spread. And so for hemophilia, which is the famous like case study in the royals, they literally think Victoria, Queen of England, is the one who like randomly got the mutation for hemophilia and started the hemophilia that goes all over Europe.
Really?
Yes. Like it's truly like Queen of England, like the OG girlie.
She spread it.
Yeah, like Brat Summer. And so because it's recessive, she had a son that like fully had hemophilia.
So she must
passed
have.
on the
so did
trait.
she not have it? She just
no.
Okay,
she was a carrier.
She carried it, and then she.
They think it was a random mutation in her genes. It wasn't like she got it from her parents.
Let's just pause. I just
mama.
want to explain to anyone who's like has no idea what we're saying when we're saying recessive alleles or these kind of things. Like there are certain traits in humans and animals related to genes that. Like blue eyes is a perfect example because it's neutral. It doesn't really affect anything. But people with blue eyes, it's like a rare trait because you have to have both versions of this recessive allele. So I could unknowingly, because my dad has light eyes, have a brown gene and a blue gene. But the brown
eye gene.
Blue eye gene and a brown eye gene. But brown in this instance is dominant, so it always wins out. So if you have one of each, you're gonna have brown eyes.
So you don't know you have like a blue eye gene necessarily. Like you don't know, but you might.
I could have been passed out, or I guess I would have been if my dad has light eyes.
What color are my eyes?
Yours are kind of like hazel greeny.
But then they're like blue sometimes, and they're
but they're not like.
But they're probably
ocean
recessive.
blue. Yeah, so it means unless.
It makes sense. My dad and my mom have like blue eyes.
Yeah. So it's more obviously if both your parents have blue eyes, that means they have both genes for it. Because if they had one brown eye gene, they would have brown eyes. And so a lot of diseases are also this issue, is that like you have to get both recessive genes in order to even get that disease. But some people carry the gene, but they have another more dominant, like quote unquote healthy gene.
So then they don't actually have the disease or have any symptoms of the disease, but they're a carrier for it.
Yes.
And that's why these diseases can like proliferate. Mm-hmm. But Victoria, Queen of England, they don't think she got this from her mama or her dada. They literally think it was a random mutation in her.
That's crazy.
I know. But that's just like what some historians think. They'll never know. And so because she passes it on to like daughters who don't have any symptoms because they're just carriers because they got a dominant from their dad, she passes it on to her son, and because we probably should not even overcomplicate it. Essentially, he does present with the disease. So they go like, oh no, he has hemophilia. But then there's also a bunch of other daughters who have the allele and no one knows. Yeah. And then they start marrying into like the Russian European monarch and the Spanish European monarch. And then those monarchies start being like, well, we're actually going to go marry into the Russian, like they all start literally inbreeding, but they're not realizing that there's this like recessive trait that's like being passed around, and they're all getting hemophilia. And like all the paintings, like when we go to Spain of like Spanish like royals are like hemophilia.
Or they've got like different issues.
So like that is like an example of why like inbreeding in humans can be bad. But one myth is that people think like, oh, when you like inbreed as humans or do incest, like the kid's gonna like have an issue or be deformed. That's not guaranteed.
Yeah, it's not necessarily. Obviously, the odds are much higher. Like, think of it this way. It's like if your family carries a gene for a disease, but it's recessive, like if you mate with a total random stranger, the odds that they also carry that are low. But if you're then mating with your sibling or a cousin or somebody who has a high chance of carrying that gene, you both pass the recessive gene onto your kid, the odds just become much greater. But it's not guaranteed. You might end up only passing your dominant gene that doesn't cause the issue to your kid. So that's why like early on, before people understood genetics, they could have no idea they were carrying these things and passing it on. But why having like familial inbreeding or incest is more likely to present these, but not
also,
guaranteed.
But also like Game of Thrones, like, so there's like kids of incest and they're all just like slay. Like it's not like they're like making the show about how incest makes you have diseases, right? Like, aren't there kids of incest in Game of Thrones who are just like the normal hot actors?
Yeah, as far as I can think about, you're not seeing like they're never like, and there's the product of our incest that's like a problem. It's
they're kind of like glorifying incest.
Literally like that's gonna be the king, and he's like
they could have at least made that a storyline. It would have been interesting.
Yes, but it is an interesting fact. And you know what's frustrating right now is you realize how much drawing little Punnett squares is what you learn in science when you're learning about like breeding and passing on genetics. It is harder to explain this with just words.
Yeah.
When you can see it visually, you can see kind of like the math of how it propagates.
But essentially it's just like inbreeding, and we're going to talk about it in animals now, increases the likelihood that you're going to potentially have symptoms of a recessive disorder if it's in your family. That is the issue. And they find that like when animals like get wiped out to really small populations and there's only like say 10 of them, then all of a sudden like conservationists come in, they're like, oh God, we have to like bring back this population because they've been like overwhaled, or like elephant seals, like there was 10 of them in the world and now there's like 200,000. So then they have to mate them. And in order to like bring back the population, they essentially have to make them inbreed.
Yeah,
and then
because that's all they have to work with.
Yeah, and all of a sudden they have like way less diversity in their genetics. They're way more susceptible to disease.
Yeah.
But it's not like there's all these elephant seals with diseases everywhere. They're just like more vulnerable as a population. So like in humans, there's so many of us that it's like...
The less variation you have in a species, then if a disease comes along that can impact you, you're all more similar. So you're all more likely to catch that disease.
And
but in a very diverse mixed population with different genetics, a disease can come, maybe only half of the population is going to be infected by it.
And the royals kind of were a little small population because they were only mixing with amongst themselves. So it's like there were so many other like peasants they could have mated with and would have been way smarter for them like biologically. But they were like, no, we're actually on our little isolated island of like disgusting royals with goats.
I really wish I could actually, like, I sometimes have a hard time understanding when I watch historical dramas or these things. Are they accurate? I want to go back through these different time periods and just see what the world was actually like. Like, what did
like a
royals
time machine?
actually live like? Like, would I look at their lives and be like, that's disgusting? Or was it so extravagant and I would be like, wow, they actually do have amazing lives? And would I look at the people on the streets and be like, wow, I could never have imagined this? Or is it like what I'm seeing in TV shows? I just like sometimes
you need to watch like a good TV show, or you need to watch like a BBC documentary. Like
I imagine I have a sense of it, but then I'm just kind of like, it's so weird to like picture zapping back 300 years and being like, what would it be like to just be in a castle with a bunch of royals?
Oh God, I assume it's disgusting, right? Like I just am like, ew. I don't know why I'm just so grossed out.
I don't know, but then you're like, you could go 1,000 years back to like ancient Egypt or 2,000 years back.
Yeah,
and,
wow,
be like,
and then that one I'm like, that's hot.
Yeah, and you're like, is it? They talk about how it was like so advanced and civilized and clean, and I'm just like, I want to see what that actually looks and feels like, and what if the representations we're getting in movies and shows is accurate or is over the top.
Civilized.
If anyone's got
civilized,
good,
that's like you like can't say that.
Oh,
at
I'm
university.
sorry. Oh.
But I forgot why. Someone told me recently.
Okay, I'm sorry. Take it back.
No. I'm just like laughing. I'm like, oh my God. I'm like, I'm in school now, and it's like that's like I was like trigger word, but like for some reason that's bad. Okay. I'll tell you next week why that's bad. Everyone's like screaming at me.
What I mean is, if anyone out there has a great example where they're like, this is known to be a great historical representation of what these different
Portrait of a Lady on Fire.
Like really?
I watched that recently and I was like, is it? It must be. It is so accurate. They're just eating bread and cheese and having a lesbian love.
That's
which might
what
be
you're
fake.
like. You're like, that's accurate.
Well,
Bread
I
and
do
cheese.
like in that movie, like when they eat, I'm like, this is what they would eat. Like they have these simple meals of like actually like a loaf of bread and cheese, and I was like, that is so interesting. Like there's not like spinach, like
right. They
they're
only
not,
can
like,
have what's locally available. At the
yeah,
time.
they're not like eating an avocado. If they saw an avocado, they'd be like, they would think it was like a witch's brew. Like they haven't even like seen an avocado.
I mean, like I hadn't seen
Actually-
an avocado till I was like 17 years
yeah,
old.
that's because you're from Guelph. I'm kidding.
You probably didn't either. I feel like avocados became popular in our lifetime.
We
in
were
North
alive
America.
when like my parents first started making guacamole, and we were all like, "Whoa!"
And even I was alive when like sushi became popular in North America. You know what I mean? Like there was a time when like there wasn't sushi that available.
yeah,
in,
now we're
in
just like
Canada.
actually like I guess I already told people we're like hitting 40, so it's like yeah, now we're really showing our age. We're like we were around when sushi was invented. Japanese people are like slapping us.
I didn't say invented. I said came to North America.
Yeah, I remember showing sushi to you, being like, Mitch, so
That's
is the big,
not
this is the big
true.
city, and this is sushi.
You're so
Pick up your
full of
chopsticks.
yourself.
Could we get him a fork? Could we get him a fork? Sorry, one day you'll be able to use these, my friend. But yeah,
And that's why people say city folk are pretentious. Okay, I'm going to talk about something interesting about inbreeding and incest in the animal kingdom. So obviously, like, we can imagine in humans and animals that it is adaptive not to inbreed. But there's even been studies on humans where they like, it's obviously very difficult in humans to study because it's a question of morality and ethics, but like they'll like manipulate people's faces to make them more or less similar to relatives. Because you have to think about it this way. If you didn't know somebody was your relative, what are the odds that you would like inherently know not to breed with them or not be attracted to them, right?
Yeah.
And so that's kind of the idea with animals is like, do they know? Like if they're breeding with an animal, like are they aware this might be their second cousin?
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
So they took
Yeah.
this big meta-analysis that looked at 40 studies over 88 species, everything from like fruit flies, it included humans. And it turns out humans may actually be the exception to the rule in that other animals have no bias against inbreeding. On the whole, 70% of animals like don't seem to care at all and will mate with their siblings, mate with their cousins. There doesn't seem to be like a bias towards that, which I thought was like really surprising.
But like, okay, but I was also reading studies on animals which found they were like surprised how little inbreeding was happening. It was still happening, but it was like not very much was happening considering they were like, it's not like they can communicate and be like, you're my cousin. They said there were natural things set up that were like, for example, like in baboons, like the females were just more attracted to like a younger mate, which usually comes in from outside and then therefore is more likely to stick around. And then naturally that usually is
Yeah,
in the
well,
family.
but were you looking across 88 species, Greg?
No, but
This
it
was
was
saying 70% of them showed that there was no bias. So obviously, in the other 30%, some species have mechanisms to stop inbreeding, and some species prefer inbreeding. Is what this is a meta-analysis of
weird.
all the studies
well, actually, because
available.
this one wasn't about them preferring it, yes or not. And actually, like in the study, they were saying, you know, in these species, there's like 2 to 3% of inbreeding, just like that happens, which is a lot. When you think about humans, like that is a lot for humans. That's not happening in humans because of morality.
Actually, I'm going to talk about that, which is really interesting. Like the inbreeding statistics for humans is actually
In Iceland,
well,
they have the Icelandic app. Remember how everyone talked about that app? They like in Iceland, they made an app
to know if it's
to
like
be like
related.
you would like meet someone at the bar and then you'd like type in their code and be like, oh, we're actually third cousins. Sorry. But that is like actually interesting because they said I read a study about that a long time ago saying that people would then actually be disgusted once they found out, even though prior
It's
they
like
were
mentally.
like literally like hitting on someone, like we're hitting it off so well. They find out that they're cousins or
Yeah.
whatever. And then they're just like, no, like
Yeah.
that's an interesting like shift in the brain of a human.
Yes, well, that's
probably
obviously
isn't happening.
social.
Like a baboon doesn't have an app to do that. My point was like, I think both of these studies can be right because yours is talking about a bias against incest or inbreeding, whereas this isn't saying there's a bias against inbreeding. They're just saying it happens, just not that much because naturally the way that like these communities of animals and things like that live, it's just like less likely for them to be hooking up with a family member because they're attracted to the way that like new.
But was that looking at all different species?
It was looking at,
because I did read that this
bunch
was
of apes.
Yeah, this was talking about how exactly what you said. Like some animals do have lifestyles that like the certain like the males will go away and find a new pack, and that's like obviously in those cases they're not going to be inbreeding as much. But this was I just thought it was interesting to think about. It wasn't saying that it's like happening so much, but this meta-analysis was also evaluating the bias in human studies to show like how much it's neglected to talk about because it's taboo for humans as well.
Incest means, like the Latin etymology of the word means unchaste or impure. So it immediately creates a negative undercurrent on the subject, incest. Whereas inbreeding is like the biological term. Which,
fair. Yeah, which is interesting because we've talked about like royals and different generations and different families through history that would have preferred it. You know what I mean? Like it is obviously cultural and contextual to where we live and who we are and what age we're in. If there's times through like whatever royal history where they were like, I want to marry my cousin, or maybe they didn't want to, but it was obviously not always like frowned upon.
Yeah, true. But like this study was saying in mammalian species, there's usually a physical dispersal by either the males or females, and it could be a mechanism to reduce inbreeding. Whereas like humans and stuff like
this was like, so the question this meta-analysis came up with was like, why would some prefer inbreeding actually, and why would there not be a stronger bias against inbreeding?
Because
obviously
diversity in genetics is like so good for evolution.
Yeah, but the idea ultimately is when you're procreating, you are passing your genes down. And so if you are passing genes down with somebody who has more similar genes to you, there might actually be an advantage to like you're actually getting more of your genes passed through. Yes, the risk is higher.
Oh, weird.
But you're actually like more likely to be duplicating and passing on your genes because you share DNA with your cousin or your sibling.
And also if there's so many like fruit flies or whatever, it's like it's not like there's like not genetic diversity. There's like millions and millions of them.
Fruit flies are crazy. We have so many in our house right now.
Don't tell everyone that. We're disgusting. We need a throuple. We need a cleaner.
No, I listened to an episode of a podcast recently explaining like it's inevitable. It's not because your house is
when
unclean.
you're dank like
they were
me.
even like you should bring when you bring new fruit in the house, you should wash it down like with water, because a lot of times they already have eggs on them and you bring it into your house. They were even like when your windows or your doors open, fruit flies are coming in, and then one can have like 1,000 babies. So it's like if you got fruit, you're gonna have fruit flies.
Okay, fine. But sometimes I'm like, damn, it's me.
It is also
my point is that like the inbreeding issue for the most part comes when there's like 11 left of a species, and then a disease comes and wipes the species out. Like if there's so many species, then you don't have to worry as much about the diversity of genetics, because there's so much diversity in the genetics because there's just so many of that species.
Yeah, I guess. I don't know how like genetically diverse a Drosophila are, but
like think about it. It's like that's how it works. Like it's not like they're all inbred. There's so many of them. Even in our house, there's like 37. Yeah. Think of how many there are in the world. So they're obviously not going to be biased towards inbreeding. That's like not as important to them as like other ways to survive and have their genes passed on. The issue with inbreeding, right, comes from when there's a small amount of that species, because then there's the vulnerability of the disease that could wipe them out fully.
Yeah, but that's not the issue with inbreeding.
Yeah, it is. It creates a vulnerability to specific things.
At the large population level, but you still have the issue of inbreeding in a larger community where the offspring will still have a higher chance of disease or like death before birth or death shortly after birth.
But if there's a lot of that species, you can see why there isn't an evolutionary pressure against it in the same way, is what I'm saying. Okay. And in all of the examples that I read about inbreeding causing a species to die out, it was when they were severely wiped out to small amounts, like isolated on an island. In this case, it was like only 2 or 3 wolves crossed an ice bridge into Canada at one point. So there was like barely any wolves. And then
all the wolves come from
they tried to get them back. They got to 50, and then there was an introduction of a virus from a domestic dog that wiped them out. So it's like that is like the issue there. Whereas if there had been, say, 200,000 dogs and some are inbreeding, that virus wasn't going to necessarily wipe out the species on that specific island.
Well, if they had been inbreeding to that point, like if those two wolves ended up having 200,000 wolves, they could still be just as vulnerable.
Yeah, I'm talking now about what you're talking about, which is other species where there's, like you were talking about 88 species, right, in general? Those are 88 species of fruit flies to humans where there's billions on the planet. It's a much different pressure than, for example, like a species that has a smaller amount and then is more vulnerable to the inbreeding issues, right? Like you're saying that like in these 88 species of fruit flies, there's not a bias against inbreeding. It kind of makes sense.
This is not 88 species of fruit flies.
Sorry. These 88 species, one of which is fruit flies.
Yes.
There's so many fruit flies in the world. I get why they're inbreeding sometimes and not have a huge bias against it is like what I'm saying. Because they're not going to die out from like a random disease. There's so many of them. And I wonder if like...
But animals don't know. Like this study is looking at the bias. Animals aren't deciding, oh, there's only a ton of us, or we shouldn't be inbreeding.
Yeah, no, I know the evolutionary pressure.
This is about what do animals do?
Yes, yeah.
And it turns out they inbreed indiscriminately.
Yes, yeah.
Most of them do.
Yeah, I'm saying it makes sense. There's not an evolutionary pressure to be disgusted or for it not to happen when there's that many species around.
I just think we're going to have to agree to disagree.
But you disagree.
No, I don't even know what point you're trying to make. We're trying to make two different points, I think.
Oh.
You're misrepresenting the study that I wanted to talk about.
Okay.
Wait,
How? Sorry. I don't understand.
I don't really know what you were trying to say.
I'm trying to say that you're saying that there are species, right, that do not have...
The majority of species on planet Earth don't think about inbreeding, and they're just as likely to, whether it's accidentally or intentionally, hook up with some animal they're related to.
Yes.
And it could just as likely hook up with an animal that they're not, but they don't automatically do that. 70% of species on planet Earth will go either way. The other 30%, some of them have a bias towards intentionally not hooking up with their siblings or cousins, and then another percentage actually intentionally choose. They're animals. They're not choosing, but they are more likely to hook up and inbreed.
Okay.
So 70% of species, based on, of course, this is a meta-analysis study. It's fallible, just like everything else. But as we see it now, there is no bias towards intentionally hooking up with someone who you're not related to.
Okay, and then what I'm saying is the reason that makes sense to me, right, is I'm saying like a lot of those species are probably not dealing with the fact that
but species don't care about that. They're not thinking.
I know, but that's what I'm saying. Like there would be...
They're not thinking.
No, but there would be an evolutionary pressure to be disgusted by incest in a species if it was actually going to be a huge potential issue for the survival of that species. It's not, because there's so many of them, is what I'm trying to say.
You don't know that there's so many of them.
I just assume, because you said fruit flies. I'm like, that's all I'm trying to say. There's so many fruit flies that they're not...
That's just one example. Yeah. I don't know. I don't have the list of all the animals, but there wouldn't necessarily be an evolutionary pressure, or so the pressure could be there, but those species could just have died off.
Yeah. I'm not saying it's true or not. I'm just saying like it's bringing me back to the original point, which is just because you inbreed doesn't mean something bad is going to happen. There's just an increased likelihood of an issue with recessive diseases. That's all within families. Okay. Because I think a lot of people do think something bad happens. That's like that's the random sort of like idea is that like when you inbreed, immediately the kid or that you have has an issue. That's what I'm trying to reiterate is like it's actually not guaranteed, especially when populations are really populated. Yeah. The diversity of the genetics is still really high.
It's not when they're populated, it's when their diversity is high.
Exactly.
Yeah. And which I guess is more likely if the population is large, but it's not necessarily.
But it's more likely when the population
if everyone came from Adam and Eve, then, you know what I mean? Like
that's insane now that I think about it.
Yeah, I know. Sick. But what I mean is there might be populations that are quite large that are genetically homogenous, and that is a risk. Speaking of humans, so when we're talking about the risk, studies have found that it's like 20 to 36% of children born of close incest. So that would be like a parent, child, or siblings. So like directly related. 20 to 36% of those children will die or have major disabilities due to the inbreeding. So it is a lot. Oh, whoa. But obviously that could still leave another 65 to 80% that are quote unquote not dying or having issues from this. And then it says the risk decreases to 4.4% among first cousins. And then the lifespan did not decrease after second cousin level. So obviously the further you move away past second cousins, it's almost like a more negligible risk. Which is probably interesting. I'd be curious what that Iceland app, like what the degree of separation it told you.
Like, oh, you can bang your third cousin. Like at a certain point in
Or would it
Iceland,
just not tell you?
In Iceland, are you just like, I have to bang my third cousin because it's like the farthest way I can get?
Yeah.
Also, we do this to animals all the time, like our dogs.
Yeah.
It's like
our chickens, our dogs,
horses.
our cows, like they're basically inbred so that they can,
they're inbred so that they're cute, like a pug.
Or that they have very specific traits.
Yeah, like a flat face that makes them unable to breathe.
Yeah, or a drive to return animals, like dead animals too.
Yeah.
Like a retriever.
But like I think it's more interesting
or,
now that like I think with dogs the like interesting part is it is kind of like aesthetic. At this point, we're not like
yes.
No one's people are buying pugs.
Yes, but it's not always inbreeding with like dogs, for example. It is like a forced natural selection.
Yeah.
It doesn't necessarily mean that they're siblings, but you're right. Like their genetic pool gets smaller and smaller. It doesn't mean they're literally breeding a brother and a sister. Like
no, but there sometimes be like
it
weird
could.
cousin. Like breeders do like
and because the genetic pool is small and they're like, oh, this family actually has like the perfect trait for the hair that we love on this dog. Okay, maybe we do breed them with
my point is they're not thinking, they're kind of using inbreeding in like an interesting way. They're not like, oh, we can't inbreed these dogs. They're like, we want to inbreed these dogs.
I don't know. I can't say, to be honest. It'd be interesting to talk to a breeder to see how acutely aware they all are of the genetic closeness of the dogs that they're breeding. I have no idea.
Like the one thing
in terms of, is there legality in Canada, for example, around like
this might have been America.
If they literally are siblings, like do you need to know? Do you have to do genetic tests, or is it just like do as you please? I don't know.
I believe it's like there probably is some regulation, but what I was reading was that horses and dogs like are constantly inbred, especially horses too, because you're trying to create this like sorry, when I say horses, I mean like the ones at Olympic level,
like racing horses.
Yeah, like they took what was an original horse and got it to this like epic place
to be like
inbreeding.
So fast,
and then what happens is like, say there's like an idealized specific type of dog in order to sort of keep the look of like certain pugs. There's just is a lot of inbreeding. I'm sure there might be some regulation, but they talked about how it's just like it is kind of interesting that we do this with animals. Like it's like
we do it with plants too. I mean, like it's not the same there. Not like we don't have like,
and plants have like different mechanisms apparently.
Yeah, but I just mean it's this idea of humans basically controlling not like evolution, but the natural selection and pressure.
Yeah, using it to our advantage. Yeah. Like bananas. That's why they're all gonna die out, because they're just like not even using seeds. They're actually clones technically, because they're actually taking the same banana plant. And then that's like what I mean. Plants is different because they're repropagating.
Yeah, it's not like sexual.
Yeah, it is different. But like every banana that you eat is like a clone of the other banana, and now there's a disease in bananas, and they're literally like, oh, we're screwed.
And that already happened with bananas. It's like that's why like I've done a video on this. Why the like banana flavoring comes from like actually like when you taste banana medicine, it's slightly different. It's like that was a more popular banana. And then it got wiped out by a disease, and now I can't remember which is which. It's like the Cavendish. I don't know if that's the one we like eat now. Became the more dominant because it like didn't get affected by this disease. But a lot of our plant species are so like homozygous. Like
it is.
What's the what word am I trying to say? Like homogeneous,
not heterozygous. but honestly, like because these bananas are clones. Yeah, you could say homozygous. Like it's not a direct relation to
homogeneous,
the issues.
That's the word I was
homogeneous. Oh yeah, it's not a direct relation to the issues of inbreeding, but it kind of is. There's a disease now in these bananas that are not genetically diverse, and like we're screwed. Like enjoy your bananas today, because like there is like a serious issue with the disease going through them, because now there's no genetic diversity.
Yeah,
but it's a lot more intense in animals and mammals, obviously. But isn't that why some dogs have like issues or whatever? Or is it just different? Like a pug has issues with breathing because we bred them to have these flat faces. Yeah. But like
it's less like, I mean, that could maybe be considered like a disorder, but I feel like it's almost intentional to a degree. And then that the intention also comes with the strings that it's like they often have like breathing problems. Or
someone said that you have to like sometimes get certain dogs and immediately get surgeries on their eyes and mouth to breathe and see. I was like, that is crazy.
And I've heard certain breeds of dogs actually have trouble even giving birth because of the way that they've been bred through time, and that they like need to have like C-sections and stuff in order to maintain that look. It's like, but then
that is like to me just like so crazy and like interesting that humans like we do this to this like companion.
We really, it is. Humans have a strange relationship to nature. Like obviously, it's very interesting and cool that we have the intelligence to like propagate ideas through nature, and to learn like even with plants, like if we mix these ones we'll get like a bigger corn, and then we can feed more people, and these are like wolves, but if we breed them this way they're more friendly and they'll want to stay around us and they're like not gonna hurt us and they're gonna protect us. Obviously it gets taken to the extreme levels, but it's interesting. And it's like, at what point does it step into a moral question? Like obviously the beginning, when people were like living with wolves and they were choosing the wolves that were less likely to bite them and more comfortable being around them, and they were like, okay, we're gonna have these ones and then they're gonna like breed,
or it's gonna retrieve the bunny I just shot or whatever.
Like you're kind of like, oh, that's innocent and smart and cool, but then there's a point where you're like, it gets kind of weird, where you're like, do we need XYZ looking dogs?
Well, this is like why you need to like, this is like why people need to study like bioethics. Like it is really important. Like I'm so in #academia right now, but it's like that is where you could get a degree, and like where do you define these lines so that you can create laws? Because it is, and even something like now we're getting into like CRISPR Cas9 gene editing to make the corn even better, and it's like,
or to say, oh look, this banana is at risk, can we modify it ourselves?
Yeah, so it's like, well, people are like, no, like the idea of no GMO, it's like so not the way people think now, because it's like, well, if we can genetically modify a corn and to feed more people and we're starving, or like why are you against
or prevent a wipeout of this species of corn?
But then at the same time you're like, but also like dogs can
there
breed.
Are risks, and
like,
also like, should we be quote unquote playing God with like everything around us? But then there's the other side of my brain that's like, maybe in 2,000 years they'll look at us and be like, of course it made sense that they were like genetically, like it'll be the equivalent of working with wolves. We're just like working with a new technology that if things work out and we don't screw up the world, it will just be like an innocent little thing that we did as
or it's more just like why science is so fascinating and why like people listen to this podcast and other science podcasts, because you're like, it is so fucking crazy. Like we live in a sci-fi movie. You don't need to go see a sci-fi movie. Like we are, humans are insane. And when you study other animals, or you even look at inbreeding and how it exists in other animals, and how we're like, oh, we actually took that concept and manipulated it for us to have a dog in our house. It's just insane. Like other animals would be like, you're crazy. Like we do so many crazy, fascinating scientific things in our day-to-day life that we just don't really think about. Including all the food we eat, and honestly like everything that we do.
Human existence
is like linked to intelligence and science and moral questions that like we don't think about day to day, but are truly there. Like it is absolutely fascinating.
And it will continue to be. I mean, there are times when recently I was like, have we stalled in technological advancements? Obviously not on the grand scheme, but like when it comes to, I know this is stupid to talk about, but like
what, AI?
No, phones, AI. Like I'm just like, people are making fun of the new iPhone because it's just like, it's literally the exact same thing as like the last two generations, except they added a button on it. Like that, obviously it's like people playing on this idea. And it does kind of feel like, when we were coming up in the age of like the internet, it did really feel like every year things are changing. It's really rapid. It's really fast. I know we were kids, maybe it's different, but I feel like adults felt that way too. And then maybe till like the mid-10s, I was like, wow, like the world is developing so fast. But it feels like we're kind of like in a little bit of a stall right now. To me, that may not be true in like many fields of science.
Well, wouldn't people then bring up AI, which I'm so sick of,
but I think people are unsure right now. Like there is a lot of skepticism. It could be really cool. A lot of people are using it for interesting ways.
Like making medication.
Yeah. And it might be impacting people's lives more than I realize. I think I'm mostly just thinking of like the technology the average person interacts with on a daily basis doesn't seem to be jumping that much forward.
So this is like my like hashtag decolonizing my mind schooling, but I genuinely, no, okay, I'm not gonna have a strong opinion on this, but what I think is that it never was actually going so fast or whatever. I think that people like we were in this sort of like neoliberal, like we're now questioning capitalism and like overtly aware of the impact of
just we're more critical of it now,
and we're living through the impact of what was always a capitalist
can see maybe
concept.
You can only ever see it in retrospect, but I think I'm just talking about like video games, right? Like the generations of console systems and the generations of phones. I remember at the time being like, this is unbelievable. Even movies being like, wow, I can't tell these graphics are fake anymore. But now it seems like a lot of those things have hit a point where you're like, it's not that different than before. It's not like suddenly I'm playing video games that feel like real life. They kind of like look a little smoother, look a little more real. But to me, they're not like huge jumps in technology. That's all I mean. But I don't disagree that we're also maybe more cynical from a capitalistic perspective.
Yeah, like we thought Silicon Valley was like benevolent,
gonna like save us.
Like
and, yeah.
that's an insane thought that I think was like a naivety of the world, because I think we were like a little bit earlier in like late stage capitalism where we were like, oh my god,
it can only do good.
Like, do you have the iPhone? Because it's like gonna change your life.
And like. Yeah.
And then it's like
we were naive around like not only intentions of a lot of corporations, but even just like what these technologies ultimately will be used for.
Yeah, like, and I think it's like we've so gotten off subject, #Sidenote, but it is interesting, I think, still, and I think it weirdly does relate. It's like about how we've used inbreeding as intellectual humans, like same with tech. Like I just think that like so many of the issues of now, climate crisis, wealth inequality, all of these things are like rooted in late stage capitalism, which has like, we're seeing the impacts of it now. And I think technology is a huge part of that. We like put like,
and we really believed technology would liberate everyone.
Yeah, it actually like made intelligent people so idiotic to what could be the progress of it, when it was really just people trying to make money in a new way. It was like a new frontier. It was like oil. It was like a new frontier of
technology
money.
will make it so you don't have to work, or so. But now it's like people work more than ever. We're more exhausted. We're more tired.
And they were like, we actually manipulated
money.
them to be addicted to our products, so we don't have to make them that much better. Like we're hooked. Like we fell for it.
Yeah, although I'd say like, I don't know where it goes
cynical
from here. I think there's a little bit of a reckoning at least. Like, yes,
I think so too.
Nothing. There's not like major revolution right now, but definitely like the like consciousness of even the global society is like at least more aware. More and more people are like, social media is bad and it makes me feel bad, and are like, these corporations are taking advantage of us. Like I think that those conversations at the very least are more pervasive, but we're still being manipulated under them. Do you want to come back to incest before we like wrap up this section? Or do you have a lot more to say?
No, I'm done on incest.
Okay. The only thing I wanted to mention, because we were talking about it not being that common, I didn't realize this, and I'm taking this from Wikipedia, so I don't want to be like insensitive culturally or anything. I'm just like reading the facts that I found on there. Like, because surprisingly, incest is legal in a lot of the world, which I didn't know. Almost all of South America and Asia, it's legal. The United Kingdom permits marriage and sexual relations between first cousins. So first and second cousin marriage is... So, okay, we're talking about first and second cousin marriage. So in North America, Western Europe, and Oceania, it's less than 1% of marriages. In South America, East Asia, and South Europe, it's 9%. And in some regions of the Middle East, North Africa, and South Asia, it's up to 50%. So obviously this is a cultural thing, is kind of what I wanted to get at, where it's like our view of what, and this may not be seen as incest, like the degree of separation, but in terms of like marriages and family bonding and stuff like that, obviously it's a cultural issue and a sensitive time issue. Like, as we're saying, like different royal families and different communities throughout time probably felt more comfortable with these kind of relations. So I just thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
Because from like a North American perspective, you're like, oh yeah, of course not. Like, we don't accept that. It's bad. But then you're like, oh, but some parts of the world like do this without thinking it's that bad.
Yeah, and I like sometimes we'll get like random texts from like my high school group thread, like, did you know so-and-so married their second cousin?
Actually?
It was like once, but it was interesting. And it was kind of like, we were all kind of like, oh, well, they didn't know each other. Like, they didn't know each other.
Right. It's not like they were grew up together.
And it's like, yeah, but I know what you mean. Like, it is obviously cultural. And as we explained, it like...
And speaking of like decolonizing your mind, I'm not saying it's good or bad, but it's interesting to think about like we grow up in a culture that teaches us what's right and wrong sometimes, but then you just go like, oh, it's interesting that other places sometimes do have fundamentally different beliefs about these things.
And just like they were talking about cousins, like second cousins, like that is like
what I read was even through history, I read that sibling inbreeding and incest has often been very taboo, and probably because the likelihood of problems is much harder. Like even the royal families and stuff would like look down upon sibling incest. So interesting that like second, third, fourth cousin is probably much more common.
And it does actually like get rid of the thing we were talking about, which is like the potential,
the high probability.
Yeah. Like the probabilities are higher, but they're not
going from potentially 36% of a death to 4% when you go to like cousins. Or I think that, let me go back to my stat there.
Oh no, this is so weird. I don't know why.
First cousins goes from potentially 36% of death or major disability to first cousins, the risk decrease to 4.4%. That is a huge biological difference.
Yeah.
So you can see why maybe there would be always a much bigger taboo on direct incest versus like.
But there's also a lot like master's students to be done about like the disgust portion of it, like what is going on, like what happens when you don't know someone's related to you, then you find out they are. Like there are studies on that where they're like you're immediately disgusted, like why? Like it is really interesting, and I think there's a lot of like moral and interesting questions here, like that are really tricky and like definitely like academic. You would need a lot of proof.
It's so hard. That's what that meta-analysis was talking about. Studies in humans are so challenging because of the ethical and moral implications. Like you cannot force people to do anything. You can only just like observe and like they said, slightly like most of the studies on humans are like slightly manipulating photos to like more or less resemble someone in their family without them realizing
Also, it is just like weird because it's like it is bio 101 to learn about inbreeding. Like it is really weird because it's like it is all just related to genetics. Like
it's like an interesting way to understand genes and alleles.
Yeah.
But obviously it's not often talked about in the context of incest in school. You're talking about the context of like species as a whole.
This is like a wild episode.
Yeah. Well, I hope it was just interesting.
So, like, I don't know why. I'm just like, it's such an it is just such an
it's like it carries such cultural like and it's taboo.
I guess what I mean is like it's so weird how like you go into like all these classes and you talk about like one thing and then you go into bio class and you're like, okay, and everyone sit down, incest. Like it is just so weird. You're like, whoa, and it's like because it is just a really like interesting and important way to understand genetics and why certain traits like get passed on and the issues from that. And anyways, okay, let's get into our
hopefully that was like interesting and not weird to people.
Well, I think like no matter what, it's like it's a taboo subject. It's a controversial subject, and the facts can be tense. We already have science here to make things sense.
Yeah, okay.
It's controversial for sure, and there's no way. And if you pretend it's not, it's a little bit.
I'm
weird.
not pretending it's not.
No, not you. I just mean in general, people might be feeling weird, and that's okay.
Yes.
Like I'm sure no one's like not thinking like whoo.
Yeah, and like obviously doing research. You were saying you were in a cafe the other day.
Yeah, I was like, I'm just reading about incest. It's like in a cafe. Like it is just like, thank God it's a science
and
journal.
You might be listening to this pod being like, if anyone can hear you right now, you're like, turn it down. Yeah. Okay, we're going to move on from this section and go to our What Jelena Speaks. We'll take a little break and then we'll be back.